Hello, folks on Zoom. Can you hear us okay? Can I get a thumbs up?
Yes, thank you.
Joe, I got a thumbs up. Thank you so much. Good to see you. We're gonna get started here shortly. If folks could just make sure that they're muted before we start. We have a very exciting presentation ahead of us.
Hey, who are you? New one person that's on there. It's like.
All right, I'm gonna do one last audio check. Can you guys let me know that you can hear us okay? All right, lots of thumbs up. Okay.
Well, hi, everybody. Do this. Hi, everybody. We have a mouth. Thank you.
That bus was dressed in a
We're great.
Yeah, all right.
So much on child safety.
So, yeah, this is the Needham Housing Coalition, and we're really glad to see all of you here and all of you on Zoom as well. We have a great program for this evening. We're really incredibly thrilled, which Oscar's going to tell you about. We're going to introduce him. Yes. Since our last meeting, we in the coalition have been doing a whole bunch of stuff, and after Amy's presentation, we're going to tell you about all the work that we've been doing and share that with you. So I'm going to pass it over to Sade for a little icebreaker, and then we'll take it from there.
Hello, folks. My name is Sade Ratliff. I am here as a CHAPA affiliate. So here at CHAPA, we have a program called the Municipal Engagement Initiative, and that's how we ended up working with the Needham Housing Coalition folks. I'm just going to lead us in a little light icebreaker, talking about some of the makeup of our town and sort of how you guys got in Needham, but also what it looks like to be a Needham resident currently. So how many of you all have had the opportunity to live in what I would label as an integrated community? So a community where you see diversity, and that diversity can range. It can be racial diversity, diversity of ability. Okay, we have some folks. Other folks haven't had the pleasure. I promise it's a great experience. It enriches your life. So if you have a chance, either in this life or the next, I'd encourage it. And then I'll do the same thing that we did last time. How many of you all live in single family homes? By a raise of hands. I don't even think I need to ask the question again. On Zoom, how many folks are in single family homes? Can you raise your hands as you look at my midsection? Okay, I see a couple of hands. On Zoom, do we have any folks that live in multifamily units? Okay, we have a couple of multi-unit folks. So I think this just goes to show not only who is in the room. I remember you from last time. Thank you for coming again. There we go. Not to just show who's in the room, but to also acknowledge who isn't in the room. So the perspectives that we're not able to see and hear tonight, and just add some perspective to the conversations that we're going to have. I am going to introduce our amazing presenter. I've had the pleasure of listening to her several times, and it's still just as good as the first time. So Amy Dain, if you would like to introduce us, get us acclimated to the type of research that you do, and then tell us a little bit about your presentation today.
I'm gonna just steal a few minutes.
Go ahead.
I have a nice.
It's the Oscar way. It's the Oscar way.
I was gonna introduce you very quickly. Amy was kind to come to an early discussion we had when we were thinking about ADUs in Needham. And she brought all of the experience she had, because one of the reports she also did with the Pioneer Institute was an analysis of the ADU growth and the history and the data and all the really good numbers that were very helpful for us in our advocacy for ADUs. And so then this release of the exclusionary by design, which was, I'm gonna say, what, 6 weeks ago? 7 weeks? November, oh my God. So yes, how time flies. Great topic, great research, and timely, and it's very great to have you here.
Thank you so much
Thank
for having me here. Should I just get started, open up?
Yeah, you can.
Great, I'm doing a screen share, so.
And then just for context, folks that don't know, ADUs are accessory dwelling, units. For folks that don't.
Okay. Hi, I'm Amy Dain. I'm a consultant in public policy research and writing. Most of my work for the last bunch of years has been focused on zoning policy. Today, I'm making this presentation about research I've done. I'm going to look at the history of zoning in Boston suburbs to shed light on the question of whether zoning has been written with the intent to exclude by race and class. As background, I conducted 2 large-scale zoning studies in Greater Boston, the first one in 2005 and the second one in 2019. So Massachusetts has 351 cities and towns. My first one looked at the zoning in 187 of them, all of the cities and towns within 50 miles of Boston. And then my second study looked at 100 cities and towns in the Metro Boston region. In those studies, I found that local zoning laws significantly ban or restrict lower cost types of housing across many jurisdictions. So many experts in urban planning and urban economics have shown that restrictive zoning has the effect of segregating metropolitan areas by race and class. The restrictive zoning has a name, exclusionary zoning. So when towns zone out diverse housing, they zone out diverse people. Reporters would ask me about my research and say, why do municipalities do this? Why do they so tightly restrict development of apartments? And honestly, I would stumble through my answers every time. Gosh, it's like so many things. Like, how do you even begin to answer that question of why? But one great resource on the question of why is William Fischel. He wrote this really cogently argued account, The Home Voter Hypothesis, in 2001. Have any of you read that? It's a great book. He argued it's all about property values. You can see on one of his books, the dollar sign, it's really about money. People invest their life savings in property, and they can't insure that investment against drops in property values. So they turn to zoning as insurance against change. Fischel's also written about social class elitism driving zoning's adoption. Then in 2017, Richard Rothstein came out with the book, The Color of Law, where he argues that zoning in the United States has been used on purpose to segregate by race, even if that purpose has never been explicitly stated. Rothstein's thesis is that the government in the United States, and we're looking at federal, state, and local, has purposely imposed racial segregation across decades of the 20th century. One of the public policies he reviews in the book used to segregate on purpose, he argued, was zoning. His account of zoning's initial spread emphasized that it was a tool of segregationists, and that across decades, racism in particular has arranged zoning's patterns. Rothstein agreed with Fischel that class bias, distinct from racism, just plain old classism, was a primary motivator of zoning, but Rothstein put more emphasis on the role of racism in zoning's story than Fischel did, and Fischel really looked back at the whole history. Meanwhile, there's always been lots of people who express all sorts of concerns at zoning hearings, you've heard them, that aren't directly about race or class. Some people argue the restrictions are about traffic, parking, aesthetics, flooding, water quality, privacy, shadows, infrastructure capacity, among other issues, and really not about race, and it's not about class. And I think that most people would acknowledge that these concerns listed here are real. Like, are you concerned about those things? And I know I'm concerned about things like flooding, but are they the main reason why zoning is specifically exclusionary? Are we good?
Yeah, folks are
Okay.
just
Oh,
joining.
just joining. Okay, I wasn't sure if I was like.
That's the
creeping
bigger
out.
audience
Yeah.
now. That's what that is.
Welcome, everybody. So Rothstein, official traffic, parking, this is all a preface to frame the big picture question, why we're here, what my presentation is about, and the main hypotheses I was interrogating. Why do municipalities adopt zoning that's exclusionary and that causes segregation by race and class? Is it a side effect, but not the intent of zoning? Or is exclusionary zoning fueled primarily by social class elitism, as in Fischel's account, or as in Rothstein's account, by social class elitism and racism? So those are sort of the three hypotheses we're looking at. I set out to see what the answers were for Boston suburbs as kind of a case study in the nation. My research approach was to look back at municipal master plans and zoning reports, which are official statements of municipal policy, to see what they say on the matter. I would also review state reports and Boston Globe articles about zoning adoption, and the research stretched back all the way to 1920. My 2005 and 2019 reports that I mentioned, for those, I read local plans that actually reached back to the 1990s. So for this report, I reviewed the information that I luckily saved in databases, organized researcher. And then I went up to the state library at the State House, and they have a stash of 13 volumes of local growth policy statements written by more than 320 municipalities in 1976. The state library also had archived plans from the 1950s and 1960s. I also visited some local libraries and did digital research. So in my written report, I cover 4 eras of zoning history, reaching back to the 1920s. But in today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the post-war era, so the 40s, late 40s, 50s, 60s, mid-century, and the big down zone of the 1970s. It's just hard to cover a full 100 years in one presentation. So first, in the mid-century plans, I found class zoning. Zoning designed to recruit and retain wealthy people and to discourage lower income, lower wealth people from moving in. The plans acknowledged the class hierarchy of municipalities and made recommendations to raise the municipal positions within the hierarchy. So Wayland's 1962 plan offers an example. It says, as population pressure has heightened, the planning board and town meeting have reappraised Wayland's position within the western section of the metropolitan area and have increased the lot area and frontage requirements for residential districts and maintained the single family residence requirement. So here we see the connection between zone density restrictions, apartment bans, and social position of the municipality. It was not only the most affluent communities striving to attract and retain wealthy residents. So Waltham's 1954 master plan explained that constituents would like to plan for an improved position as a desirable residential community in metropolitan Boston, one which will not become too densely populated. So position and density are connected. And I went to Dedham's library to find its 1947 plan written by leaders in land use planning, the Shortcliffe, famous in land use history. Dedham's 1947 plan said a 40,000 square foot minimum lot size, and that's roughly an acre, was recommended as a means of keeping up property values and attracting well-to-do newcomers. So we see again, low density zoning as class zoning. And it isn't just these select quotes. In mid-century, many municipalities were explicit about their use of zoning for social class positioning. Class exclusion was not a side effect. We can cross that out. It was definitely a purpose. Now, class zoning overlaps with somewhat with a concept called fiscal zoning. Anyone here heard of fiscal zoning? This is like a new concept today because it's a little wonky. With me. So what is fiscal zoning? If you zone for large lots, you get more expensive housing, which increases your tax receipts per house. So fiscal zoning is zoning for the sake of local municipal budgets. It's about paying for things like schools and infrastructure. So like why zone for large lots? Many public officials and plans have argued it's primarily about fiscal responsibility. The goal of class zoning is social status, position on the social hierarchy of municipalities. The goal of fiscal zoning is high tax revenues relative to expenditures. So as an example, in the 1950s in Canton, Canton gained small lot subdivisions in its Cedar Crest Highland neighborhood. So you can picture it like ranches and split levels, small ones and small yards. The town collected approximately $300 in taxes per new home in the 50s, but the cost of educating just one child in these like single family houses was $423, more than you were getting from the house in taxes. So this was presented at town meeting in the 50s, and Canton rezoned for 1 acre minimum lot sizes. The large lot zoning there looks like both class zoning and fiscal zoning. And really, class zoning and fiscal zoning can be two sides of the same thing, right? It's about zoning for wealthier people. But this story has a plot twist. As far as wonky zoning stories can have plot twists. But in the mid-century era, multifamily housing apartments were generally seen as a fiscal positive. They're good for your municipal budget because few school children lived in apartments in the suburbs. Owners of multifamily buildings paid more in taxes than the residents of the apartment buildings needed in services. And so the mid-century debate, town by town, city by city, about whether to zone for apartments went like this. Should we allow apartments? On the pro side, there's a need for housing. People are saying we need the housing, seniors need the housing, and apartments are a fiscal benefit to a municipality. The reasons not to allow apartments in the mid-century period was generally that apartments hurt a town's socioeconomic position within the metropolitan area. Now, this is an important distinction because municipal officials often say that the reason for exclusionary zoning is fiscal. But we see that at least in this mid-century period, fiscal considerations actually favored apartments. And there were a number of communities that considered the pros and cons that I just listed and decided to ban apartments completely or almost completely in mid-century. So Weston, Carlisle, Dover, Duxbury, Wenham, and other municipalities made up an executive belt of estate zoning. They figured they could forego the fiscal benefits of apartments for the sake of status. And to put it another way, other municipalities zoned for apartments to increase their tax revenues, to pay for schools and everything. But the most affluent municipalities didn't need the tax revenues. They zoned to maintain their status. So in the mid-century period, in part for fiscal reasons, and this is what I found so interesting, more communities allowed apartments than banned them. Many suburbs of Boston permitted hundreds and even thousands of apartments. And back in 2004, when I did my first study, I would like see these apartment buildings around and be like, how did those ever get approved? Like they're not, the zoning doesn't allow them now. What was going on back then? And you know these mid-century apartments, because like you two have seen them all around, all over the place. They look like this. And actually, I lived in this one in the 1990s in my 20s, and it was great, relatively affordable housing. It was this apartment building here was permitted in the 1960s before the big down zone. So in the early 1970s, especially 1972 and 73, most municipalities that had allowed apartments, and most did allow apartments, voted to ban them. This was a remarkable level of action, requiring 2/3 supermajority vote to ban apartments. In some places, zoning for apartments was just completely removed from the zoning bylaw or ordinance. In others, moratoriums were passed. In some, the requirements were tightened to only allow low-density apartments. And in some, the zoning had already been revised in the mid-century period to require discretionary approval. But in the mid-century period, discretionary approval was yielding approvals. In the period of the big down zone, discretionary approval became a dead end. You're not going to get a permit for a high-rise apartment building or a garden apartment building like those brick ones I showed. So the question is why? Why did the whole region down zone all at once? Question why. There are a lot of factors. So first of all, the environmental movement in the early 1970s was gaining momentum, and development has impacts on water, air, and habitats. The anti-highway movement was gaining momentum and opposing growth and traffic. And communities had been suffering growth pains from 2 decades of like hypersonic growth. Acton built 7 schools in 15 years. Like that's a school every other year. It was a lot. So communities were ready to slow down. So we've got concerns about the environment, traffic, and growth pains. Check. But if this were primarily about the environment, they could have allowed apartments, but just away from rivers and wetlands with big setbacks. They could have allowed apartments in walkable hubs. If it was just about traffic, they could have promoted public transportation and allowed for apartments by train station. And for sure, some of the downzone was a reaction to growth pains, but apartments had been seen as a fiscal positive. And there was an understanding that compact development is more efficient for infrastructure than sprawl. So the ideas that later got called smart growth or new urbanism or compact development and transit-oriented development, these are like hot terms now, they were available in the 1970s to municipalities. And I saw all of these concepts in the 1970s or like around 1970 plans, just not labeled with those terms, but the concepts were in them. So municipalities were not only downzoning for the sake of the environment, easy driving and low taxes, they were banning all apartments like everywhere. The big downzone happened very suddenly and intensely at a specific point in time. It was a time of racial change, of civil rights victories, and a growing call for desegregation of the schools and neighborhoods. So the big downzone was in the 1970s, but I'm going to back up my timeline to 1965 and walk us forward in time. So here's Weston's master plan, 1965. It stated social goal, accommodate further moderate population growth in a manner consistent with the present characteristics of Weston. Weston was 99% white and its residents quite affluent. They did not say a goal to preserve the built character. And in fact, you can see here, it's a picture of their plan. The physical goal was stated separately from the social goal. This is 1965. What was happening in 1965? 1965 is the year of the Selma marches. 1965 is the year that Martin Luther King came to Boston, spoke at the Parkman Bandstand, and before the state legislature, saying that segregation of the North is a new form of slavery. And I went and found his speech in the digital archives. You can see a little screenshot from it there. In the 1960s, Black migration to Boston increased. By 1965, 17% of Boston's residents were Black. In 1964 and 1965, US Congress adopted landmark civil rights legislation. In 1968, Newton's housing report, written by Newton's planning department in-house, called out the racist attitudes they saw as animating opposition to housing. In 1968, Congress passed the Federal Fair Housing Act as a central piece of civil rights legislation in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. Leaders of the civil rights movement and its participants understood how important housing policy was for desegregation. Committees formed across multiple suburbs with the goal of opening up zoning. In these years, planners, journalists, state and federal officials, activists were calling out zoning as a tool of segregation. It was a crescendo of activism. In 1970, a headline in the Boston Sunday Globe read, "Will suburbs see the light? Rezone for apartments." This was the big question of the 1970s. And we know the answer, the big down zone. A state report issued in the 1980s offered this illustration of what had happened. In the early 1970s, a US federal court ordered busing of students to desegregate Boston schools. It actually started on September 12th, 1974, which was the day I was born. And my dad tells me that he was a chaperone on one of the buses, but he can't remember if it was day 1 or day 2 of the desegregation. And maybe also because he was like sleepless when, at the time, he doesn't remember the details. But he was a chaperone because reactions among many white residents were harsh, angry, racist, and sometimes violent. And many Boston residents, including many renters, were looking to move to the suburbs if they could find a place. Zoning is a part of the school segregation story, but it doesn't make for good photos. And it's mostly invisible and it's really obscured by complexity. So zoning gets you photos like this. And here we return to the library. In response to the big down zone and the mood of anger and confrontation, the state legislature required every city and town to write a local growth policy statement, to imagine the future that they would like to behold and to think through how to accomplish that. It was designed as a conciliatory exercise in state and local partnership to support growth and change. Municipalities had to form local growth policy committees made up of city manager or mayor, heads of the conservation commission, housing authority, health department, and planning department, and 5 citizens. And then each committee would hold 2 hearings and fill out this long questionnaire. More than 320 of Massachusetts cities and towns submitted the statements. And they're all bound here up in the state library. I wanted to know how the statements explained the big down zone. These were all issued in 1976. What do the statements tell us about the motives of the big down zone? So first of all, in a ring around Boston, municipalities articulated their growth policies as no growth policies. As a good example, Natick's statement said, "At this time and in the foreseeable future, there is little or no advantage in believing our mission is growth." This is the basic policy statement of the big down zone. The class aspect in the statements was explicit, the same as we saw in the mid-century reports. One town wrote, "We've got at least our share of poor people." The statements do mention environmental concerns, traffic and fiscal issues, and class elitism too. So we can check these off and I won't spend a lot of time on those. But my question in looking at this was, what about race? The statements do not name race as a reason for no growth policies, while they do name class and other concerns. Holliston's statement said, "A town should continue to maintain socioeconomic status as at present." So the federal court had just intervened to desegregate Boston schools after the court had found evidence in school committee minutes that the Boston School Committee had been segregating on purpose. Everyone knew there would be consequences if they named racism as a reason to stop growth. And a bunch of the plans said, "I hope you're not doing this as a gotcha exercise, like to catch us on this." So these were written with this whole concept in mind and without the sense that Amy Dain would be coming back to these decades later. So what do the statements say? Demographic change in Boston was a clear factor in the down zone. Quincy's statement reads, "In the recent past, Quincy attracted many new residents, especially from the South Boston and Dorchester areas, due to their perception of the city of Quincy as being less metropolitan and more residential in character. The most direct impact of this condition upon the city has been the development of a strong sentiment on the part of old and new residents to limit the growth of the community, thereby maintaining this residential quality." So I just wanted to emphasize that it's explicit here that people are moving out of Boston and the down zone is happening in response. Melrose's statement names social structure as a factor with people moving out from Boston. The social structure is becoming more urbanized. Melrose's direct stated response is growth is not needed. Milton is next to Boston. Milton's been in the headlines so recently. Milton's statement states that the goal was for Milton to stay substantially as it was, quote, "to preserve and protect the unique character and identity of the community." Under the heading major growth related issues, the statement lists the pronounced changes in the areas contiguous to Milton. The area contiguous to Milton includes Mattapan that had just quickly transitioned from majority white to majority Black. Another major growth issue listed was crime and the apparent breakdown of our society. Dedham's statement tells us again what we've heard. Dedham is variously beset by the myriad regional problems common to all towns, similarly for the city of Boston, subject to echoes of every new or old happening or development within the city. So Belmont's goal was to maintain its status, and it saw itself as unique in resisting apartments while being so close to Boston, only 9 miles away. Belmont's statement reads, "The continuing protective attitude and desires of the residents with their attendant political power will tend to protect the status quo and prevent change in the town from its single-family, two-family character. This town will remain a relatively expensive place to live, and so will attract only those families so economically situated." A Needham statement, get to Needham? The statement said, Needham's goals may be defined as preventing major changes to the physical character of the community as a whole. Now, the argument could be made that preservation of the built environment and character is not about race. It's just that people like their towns, the way they look and how they function. And I think that they really do. But I'm reading Needham's statement and I come to this appendix. The statement says, before the Appendix A represents the efforts of certain members of the Congregational Church of Needham and does not represent the consensus opinion of the committee, nor is said appendix endorsed by the Growth Policy Committee. So what does this unendorsed appendix say? The moral and human costs of segregation are intolerable. Opening up our town and others like ours is in the interest of all citizens. We picture Needham offering a broad spectrum of housing from multifamily dwellings to single-family homes of various sizes and values so that it may have a more heterogeneous population. Now, a few of the local growth policy statements read more like Needham's appendix than Needham's statement. They call for integration, for diverse housing, for abundant housing. These statements represented a minority of municipalities at the time, but they spoke with a clear voice. Newton, Lexington, Situate were in this category, along with Needham's appendix. Newton's statement has in its goals the development of varied densities of housing for all income and age groups, the commitment of the city to achieve the development of sufficient number of housing units to meet the projected demand for housing. This is in addition to language about the need for integration in Newton's plan. Now, the questionnaire asked about what changes are needed to fulfill the municipality's vision for growth. Now, Situate, that was in this category with Newton and Needham's appendix. Situate statement said that to fulfill this vision, changes in attitudes of many townspeople would be necessary before the desired future could be achieved. As an example, many townspeople have in the past voted against most proposals to permit apartments. And so this is actually what we see in the history in Newton and in Lexington too, that the votes were not there for diverse housing, even when the statement supported it. Context is important here. It's the 1970s. Many Black people in the 1960s and 1970s moved to Boston for opportunity. Most of them were in the rental market for housing. Many were looking for apartments. Most suburbs were 99% white. Some were 98% white. There were loud, clear, organized calls for desegregation, for diverse housing, for diverse people across the suburbs. In this context, suburbs mobilized tools of public policy, of public laws, for the preservation of the status quo, which was highly segregated. In this segregated context, plan after plan suggested that new housing should serve existing residents the municipality and employees in the municipality and not be for outsiders. In my read, we can say that exclusionary zoning of this era was exclusionary, not primarily to protect the environment and manage traffic and local budgets, but for reasons of social class elitism and racism, for the purposes of protecting the advantages of suburban insiders at the expense of outsiders of suburbs. This was done with the understanding that outsiders of the suburbs included populations called out for protection by the Fair Housing Act of 1968, including Black people. The bans on apartments served to restrict access by many disadvantaged people to the public services, the social networks, and opportunities that many suburbs offer. The bans on apartments created areas of concentrated wealth and areas of concentrated poverty. Zoning put economic polarization on the map, and zoning undermined social mobility. The big down zone also led us to our current era of housing shortage and escalating home prices. There's more on that in my report. I cover a lot more history. I think that these are just like really challenging topics, but I think that understanding how we got here and getting a grip on the complexity should help us to forge solutions. And I look forward to learning your ideas about how to make our policies more just. And I really appreciate your energy in making the world a better place. So thank you for the opportunity to present. Thank you for organizing this forum. And it's really an honor to have your attention. And I link to all of my reports and articles on my website. So stay here.
Thank you so much. Incredible. Like I said, I've heard that presentation a multitude of times, and I think that it's different every single time, and I learned something new. So thank you so much for putting that forward. I will pass it back to the Housing Coalition folks to see if you want to open it up for questions, if you want to give folks a chance. While you guys are thinking about questions, I also want to give folks a moment to acknowledge that this is a lot of hard material. I think sometimes it's hard to sort of see yourself in your face and realize sort of the genesis of the things that we're seeing change in your town. So acknowledging that this is hard information to hear and it's hard to digest, but also understanding that there's quite I wouldn't say a small group, there's a good number of you, but this is not all the people that need to hear this information. So encouraging you to digest it, but then also give it to the people in your community after this point. So Housing Coalition folks, would you like to take it away? Do we have a fearless leader among our ranks?
Do we have what, a mic?
Do you have a hand mic?
We don't. We don't have a hand mic. Yeah, we are a small group.
We can hear you.
If we could just project, and then if we have any issues, exactly, any issues with the mic on Zoom, I'll repeat your question. So don't mind if I interrupt.
Yeah, we have nothing prepared, no.
Do you want me to end my screen?
Yes,
share?
yes.
Well, I'll make
Thank
it-
you.
I have a few comments to make. I'm Catherine Berkeley, and I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I went to a public school that was 70% Black.
Okay.
And then this was I was born in 45, I'm old. Then there was this big migration of people from Poland, all of the revolutions from the mid-50s, Hungarian Revolution, lots and lots of immigrants there. So basically, a lot of the white people in that 30% were also not just middle-class Americans. And it was such a wonderful experience. I had so many friends. My parents tell a story about how my best friend was named Dain, and my mother didn't know that she wasn't Black, that she was Black from the name, but because it was Blondine. But my parents had moved into Ann Arbor, and they specifically chose this place. They moved from Texas. And my father was very active in civil rights. People like Bayard Rustin was at our house often, and people like that were part of my childhood. But when I was really little, I didn't know. I always thought that anything to do with white versus what was called Negro then was just an adult problem, not a kid problem. And that is one of the things that won't happen to kids growing up here. They will see them as others as opposed to just us. And that is a tragic consequence, that people are doing terrible things to their children by that environment. Going ahead to several decades, we now have a problem in the Boston area that goes beyond just race and economics. We have a problem where people who are my age, I'm 78, own houses free and clear, and are not allowed by zoning rules to have non-related people living with them. I can tell you, can't tell you that it's a small amount. A large amount of my friends have the needs to have somebody living with them just so they feel secure. They're widows, or they feel secure that somebody would be there if they fell. And don't even begin to think that those I've fallen and can't get up things really work. They don't. So then you have the zoning on the other side of this, where you've got people who need places to live, young people who need places to live, big houses that have room for them, and they're not allowed to rent, and people who own the houses, and they're not allowed to rent or have those people live with them because they're not related. This is also another thing that goes into a zoning problem. And so when you talk about diversity, I want you to think not just in terms of race, but think of it in terms of age as well, and all the other things, not just race. It's a big deal. There's no place for my friends to go. I happen to be a renter. I happen to live in an apartment. I don't have housing security. My son pays my rent because I can't afford it. But I live in a 2-flat house. It's on a big piece of property. My landlord's getting to the age where he might retire. He can get like $1.5 million for that house for his retirement. And it would be bought, and it would certainly not stay, because the house was built in 1926, certainly not stay as a 2-person house, be torn down, and because the lot's big, it would be another big house. I don't have housing security. Every time my lease comes up, I'm worried. Then I won't have anywhere to go. So it's a very complex issue, and racism, I can't don't underestimate the big role racism plays. There's redlining and all kinds of other subtleties that happen around that. But include, when you're talking about diversity, think about other things like this.
Yeah.
That are out, I guess they're outgrowths.
Exactly.
That all of the things that Amy presented, the historical things where you're getting to a smaller community, all people that were in little boxes, I guess, as they're looking at houses. And so I just want, that's okay. So I'm not on my soapbox anymore.
I love that. I love that. I really love hearing your observations, and I hope like we can make this a conversation. Like I'd love to hear other experiences and perspectives.
For sure. And I think I'll add to your point. I think that it's really important to include that as part of the conversation, acknowledging that I'm the only Black person in this room. So if we sit and we have a siloed conversation about racism, like it might not affect you past tomorrow. You know what I mean? So talking about the issues that are affecting you all in the room, and like Amy said, creating a conversational environment where we can talk about these things. And for sure, I'm a proponent that age and ableism and things that are within that fold of diversity are things that we should always be talking about. I think racism and just talking about race gives us sort of an open door, but it should never stop there by no means, by no means.
You're so awesome.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I got a college degree and everything. No, I'm kidding. Go for it.
I have a question. It was striking to see that things that are being said now were said in, what is 75 is 50 years ago, 60 years ago now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So nothing's changed in terms of those attitudes. And I was just wondering, because you have taken this show on the road, whether you're seeing light bulbs go off at all on the part of municipalities to say, oh, you know, we've made this community that is homogeneous or close to homogeneous, and such a shame that is the case. And anyway, have you seen any forward movement from this yet?
Yeah, I mean, the topic feels huge right now, right? And it's interesting in terms of like a pro-housing movement. I actually just got back from Austin, Texas, from the YIMBY Town Conference, YIMBY being yes in my backyard, like, yes, I want housing where I live, more housing where I live. And a lot of people there were talking about the YIMBY movement started, I think, around like 2012 or 2013. And like, they talked about that as the beginning, but I'm like, well, I was working on this in 2004, but then like, I realized from this research, yeah, like the conversation was very similar in like the 70s and the 60s. Like it wasn't even new in 2004. Like I was on the cutting edge of something. Like I found the same conversation like in the 90s. Like all throughout, there have been people working on this and framing it this like the same way we are now. But I do think the YIMBY movement has been like picking up nationwide since 2012 or, you know, in the last decade. And now with the MBTA community zoning law requiring that so many cities and towns amend their zoning to allow multifamily housing by right near train stations if possible, has changed, has sort of forced the conversation. We're seeing tons of leadership growing in all of these municipalities to lead zoning change. And we're also seeing opposition getting organized, but I think that these messages are definitely like resonating places. And I don't know, I like present on Zoom a lot, so I don't know that I'm seeing like light bulbs go off. I'm like, I assume there are people out there I'm talking to. It's nice to see you in person and come to a real library. And I'm doing more presentations this spring, some in person. But yeah, I think there are so many facets to the issue. So some is thinking historically about like race and class, like in my presentation, but then there are a lot of just current day issues of like, where can I live? Is my rent's going up? Like, where would I move to? Those kind of questions too. Yeah.
Amy, you said in your presentation that there was a handful of towns, Newton, Lexington, that the Needham appendix that kind of wrote where your plans alluded to diversity being a good thing.
Right.
But you said none of the plans actually followed through. None of the towns actually executed.
Yeah.
And how did that, even though they had a committee plan, and some of these towns had a committee plan that said, we want to have more diversity, we want higher density housing. How did it work such that that guy killed, went to town vote, or how did that pan out?
I put a few case studies in the report where I go into depth in like Newton and Concord, and Weston, looking at exactly what happened. And Newton was a really interesting case. There was this whole coalition that included a faith coalition with, from churches and rabbis included, looking to change the zoning and allow mixed income housing. And they even like figured out a plan where they targeted 10 different properties to zone for 500 units of mixed income housing. And they were trying to push it through city council to get approval. And then the city council didn't approve it. And ultimately, like after like a multi-year effort, like a 10-year effort, we saw 50 units of mixed income housing was built in the center, like Langley Street, Langley Road. So it was like just a major effort, and it even, I think they might have tried to go the route of 40B for that, and it went to the State Housing Appeals Committee, and then there were like 42 hearings held where the opposition was like, we'll just keep holding hearings, like keep bringing people out to just exhaust the resources of the nonprofit groups that were organizing to build the housing.
Developers too, developers throw their hands up.
Yeah, yeah, so in this.
Time and cost to go out to argue for years.
Yes, that's kind of what we saw, is that these like in my case studies, I was looking at nonprofit developer groups, and they were just exhausted the resources. And I think that in this case, there was so much momentum from the late 60s, like people really like believed in it and felt like they were doing something to change the world and really correct these historic issues. But you know, you bring things up at the local setting, and it's like pits neighbors against neighbors and it gets nasty and people get exhausted. And I think that by the late 70s, there was just like a retreat and that people were like, let's work on some issues where we're gonna have some easier wins. And it's interesting because I feel like by the 1980s, the topic was basically dropped. And like, that's why for me, like growing up in the 80s and 90s, like I never knew this history was like completely forgotten because people weren't talking about zoning that way in the 80s. I just thought setbacks were like requirements and zoning was like a way to make so that neighbors weren't arguing with each other when you wanted to put a deck on, like we'll respect each other's privacy, like that it was like a non-controversial issue and really like a technical thing. And I think so there was this disconnect with this really heated history, even though I said there were some people who all along were working on this and kept working on it. I think as a popular issue, it had been forgotten and that the 1980s coming off of this really tough period with the school busing episode and the violence and all the social change, like just was this retreat from that and the sense that like, we're gonna just work on easier issues for a while. But I don't think that that's like, it has to turn out that way every time. I think that sort of was the playbook then. And I think that one of the lessons here is that state leadership has been really important. And it was in 1969 that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts passed Chapter 40B. So 69, like even before the big down zone, and this was also like the result of all this advocacy is the state legislature. So we're going to create this vehicle where developers can bypass and like affordable housing developers too can bypass local zoning to go.
Whoops.
Income housing. And so they passed this really important law there, and it's led to a tremendous amount of housing development of affordable units. And it's also been a really important tool I found just for housing development in general, because often a developer will say, if you don't approve this project through your local zoning, I'll come back with a bigger 40B project. And so it gets municipalities to come to the table. So I don't want it to just be like, oh, this is all hopeless. Like 40B came out of that activism and is a law on the books that has for decades allowed more housing development, more affordable housing development. And I'd also say that that 40B was brought to popular referendum in Massachusetts in 2010. And you'd think like, how would that ever pass if it came to the voters? But the voters approved it in 2010 because people realized ultimately that that's like a really important tool for housing development that the state needs and for affordable housing. So I think to me, some of the lesson is that when we make these decisions just at the local level, a certain set of outcomes come from it. But when we all think about this from the state level of what's good for the public good, and even when we're voting on a statewide referendum on something like 40B, we think about the issue in a different way and we come out with different outcomes. So that's sort of
40B wasn't driven through by the legislature, it was driven through by citizens referendum?
Oh, no, in 1969, the state legislature passed 40B. But in 2010, some people brought it to a referendum because they wanted to overturn it. They wanted to remove it from state law. It was a statewide referendum on 40B, and actually it passed. So it was originally, and the 69 story is kind of interesting too, because like, how did that even pass in 19?
Passed to reverse 40B? I'm sorry.
No, we still have 40B. In 69, it was adopted, and then in 2010, people brought it to a referendum in order to reverse it, but they lost. People,
just did one. Like the person there actually did.
Yeah, but that one, then, yeah. Right, the opposite.
The referendum was brought and it actually.
Yeah. So in 1969, the story is kind of interesting that Boston had a lot more representatives in the state legislature because Boston used to have more population relative to the rest of the state. And I think probably the census hadn't caught up with like the white flight and the growth of the suburbs yet. So Boston had a lot more representation than the suburbs did. And in 1965, the legislature had passed a law saying that Boston had to desegregate its schools even before the courts came in and said to desegregate. And Boston actually didn't implement the law of the state saying, Boston, you have to desegregate your schools in 1965. But the Boston legislators saw as their kind of like revenge to the suburbs for making them desegregate their schools by passing 40B, saying if you want us to desegregate our schools, you have to desegregate your housing. But it was, the people pushing that weren't necessarily like for integration and all the good things. They were just like, stop asking us to desegregate in the city. And so there was a coalition of these city legislators with suburban liberals from places like Brookline and Newton who supported 40B, and it passed at that time. Yeah.
So I have a question about housing authority. We have quite a few units in our town from the 50s and 60s, I think. My understanding is that the state was one of the few states that put money into affordable housing. So I think 40% of the folks who live in our Needham Housing Authority units are people of color, of other backgrounds than the typical background in the single family homes. So can you tell me
No,
about?
that's not right.
Oh,
I worked for the housing authority this summer and I know about that. It's not right. It's not, it's just that low income people, a lot of people of color who live in town are low income and can qualify for that, but it's not 40% by any stretch.
I thought that's what Reg told me. Anyway, the people who are living in the low income unit are more people of color than the other parts of town. So that's for sure. And
That's definitely for sure.
yeah, and my question is, and I like having these units in town. Obviously, that's why I mentioned. But I'm wondering why the state did that at that time. I mean, it doesn't sound like it flows from the rest of your presentation. Why that would happen? Did you know?
To the building of affordable housing in particular.
These are deeply affordable.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they're 60% AMI.
Yeah.
units, yeah.
I have not like done the history of like deed
Oh,
restricted
okay.
affordable housing. It's really like an interesting question and like what the funding flows were like from the federal government in those time periods. And I think that
was
there's a
one
lot
reason.
about like veterans housing too. There was a particular movement then, you know, after World War II
Veterans
to
housing
house the
was
veterans. And so some of it was around that. And I know there's also a history around like creating the deeply restricted housing for, like deeply affordable housing for seniors in the suburbs at that time was often easier to like get through than, deeply affordable housing for anybody in the population, in the suburbs, but I don't know Needham's specific
Okay, thank you.
story or like what the funding was, but I do know these issues were all playing out in the history of, you know, affordable housing.
A good question.
We have time for one more question, if there's one more question out there.
Oh, someone is asking, I wanna leave this question to the group. Someone in our Zoom asked, what is the definition of affordable housing? So when we're having this conversation around affordable housing, what does that mean? Are we talking about deeply affordable housing? Are we talking about low income housing? Are we talking about subsidized housing? What, so in the context of, I guess, your presentation and your conversation, could you explain what affordable housing would look like?
Sure. I mean, affordable housing, we think about it as like capital A affordable housing, where we're thinking of deed restricted affordable housing, which could be like public housing, or it could be deed restricted private affordable housing that's privately owned. Like included in an apartment building where you have a subset of units are restricted for to be rented at rates that are affordable, at usually like 80% or 60% of area median income, and you have to meet income requirements in order to rent those units. Complicated. That's like strictly affordable. Then there's like lowercase a affordable housing, which doesn't, I don't think have like a strict definition. And then what's like affordable to one person isn't affordable to another. But thinking in general, when we're talking about affordable housing, it's not with the capital A, it's just about being affordable to a larger part of the population.
Right, right. Hopefully that answered your question, Zoom user.
Great, great. And let's take Ken's question.
It's going to be more for NHC, but what can we do as Needhamites to get people who are more skeptical about a changing landscape and diversity, how are we able to make them more excited about seeing more diversity in the future?
That is a good question. Can I start to answer the question?
Yeah.
So I've had this conversation with a lot of my colleagues, and I think oftentimes it's involving them in the conversation. We have this saying that's called, what is it? Why FIM? So Wi-Fi M, what's in it for me? And people usually don't care about a social issue if it doesn't affect them. No one cared, well, let me not say no one, but most people didn't really care about climate change and things like that until we started to be like, wow, the weather patterns are a bit funky. Maybe I should look into this climate change thing that folks are talking about. So getting people invested and helping them understand that the future of your child's education is dependent on the amount of diversity in your community. Whether that be diversity in housing, diversity of people, diversity of ages, diversity of ability, and helping them to understand that in creating a more diverse world, you're not losing anything, you're gaining everything that we're bringing to the table. And I find that that's usually the angle that I use to work diversity into a conversation, or even to just have this conversation about the lowercase a affordable housing that we're trying to implement. So letting people know that, like, our goal is not for you to not be able to drive to work. Our goal is not to increase traffic. Our goal is not to X, Y, and Z. It's simply to just create a more thriving community. It's our goal is to give your kids places to move back to after they graduate and they go off into the big wide world and decide to come home. You know what I mean? So involving them in the conversation and giving them a stake, I think is part of the way to involve them in the fold. But if anyone has sort of other layers as people that are from Needham, love to hear it.
Well, it does segue nicely into the
Yeah.
next part of our meeting, if I might. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you.
And you've given us some of the answer to Ken's question too, I think, bringing up that history and how we got to where we are. What we would like to do, with the remainder of our time is kind of answer Ken's question. So in Needham Housing Coalition, we've started working groups because we want to work, we want to have the conversations that Shade mentioned and provide the kind of information that people need. We needed to communicate with them. We need to be looking at the NHA. We need to be looking at the MBTA. So we have 5 working groups. And what we'd like to do is give you a very brief definition of what each of them is doing. And then we're going to have a science fair. And walk around, and there will be people in that corner talking about having housing conversations. How do we set these up? How do we get out there and find groups of people? We'll have people talking about, I guess I'm just doing. About campaigning for town meeting and also campaigning our town meeting members so that we get the votes we need to move legislation and policy that we would like to see. Have people over there talking about media and technology. How do we get the word out? Many of you are on our mailing list, you get our newsletter. There are lots of other ways that we can be communicating, and we want to do that efficiently. Education materials is us writing the answers to these questions. People have questions, people have concerns. We need to answer them, and we need to put forward the very positive arguments, like what Shade did, and MBTA planning. There's a lot going on. The Communities Act, and there's a group working on that, on our position with regard to that law. So what we'd like you to do is walk around, ask questions, and see if you would like to get involved. If any of you would like to become part of these working groups, even tangentially, even just to see what it's about, we have found that the people who come forward have such amazing skills and passion. And I know you do too, so we would love to have you help us out with that. So that's what we're gonna do, right? You know what? I think it'll be hard to get people back, so I'm gonna go to the end. Which is simply to say, at our next meeting, which is at the end of March, we have, I wrote it down. We have the Executive Director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts, Jesse Henson Benaval. Ben enough, coming to speak then. We have a petition that is generally for more housing choice in Needham. In the back, if you haven't signed up, please do. We have yard signs, they're free, please take one. The ground is thawing, it's a good time to stick one in the ground. And do we have a feedback form or something? No, we were going to say that one. And please join our mailing list if you're not already on. And thank you so much for coming. So let's disperse, have conversations, and see if people can help.
For folks on Zoom, I've included the working group descriptions in our chat. You can feel free to let me know if you'd like to join one of the working groups, and I can make sure you're connected with the point person. But if you guys would not like to join a working group, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again in March. Jose, are you still there?
Thank you.
Jose?
Well, I have one in my, jacket.
Yes, I am driving.
Okay, I just wanted to let you know, we're gonna send you a translated version of the recording afterwards.
That's
But that, some of it is. Before the next. People would move to opportunity. People would move to opportunity.